Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we're marking the release of 10,000 Commandments, an annual snapshot of the federal regulatory state compiled by our first guest, Wayne Cruz, Vice President for Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He'll be followed in the second half of our show by Michael Mandel, Chief Economic Strategist at the Progressive Policy Institute, who has a somewhat different view on how to best scrape the regulatory barnacles off the ship of state. But first, let's dig into 10,000 Commandments. Wayne, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate you having me.
Wayne, before we get into the meat of your report, help us understand the big picture. Regulatory advocates point to the intended benefits of regulations: clean air, safer drugs, more fuel-efficient cars, while detractors point to hundreds of billions of dollars in both visible and hidden costs. Democracy is supposed to balance those kind of trade-offs. How do our elected representatives make sure we're getting our money's worth out of regulations and not just strangling the economy?
Bill, regulation is kind of an interesting thing. You have to ask exactly what it is you're trying to do. You know, free enterprise, it doesn't mean that companies just get to run roughshod over the public and do whatever they want to do. Presumably, we want safety, a clean environment, economic efficiency. I've got 4 kids myself, and I want all those things. But that's different from saying a big administrative state, this large administrative state that we've set up in the United States now, is the best way to go about it. Presumably, the concern in favor of regulation is that companies are running roughshod over the public. But if that's true, then we should also be alarmed when those very same companies get control of the regulatory process, which does happen in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think they call it regulatory capture, and it seems to be a regular drama in Washington.
It is a regular thing. It's happening quite a bit, and it happens across the spectrum. It happens, from large-scale regulations like in the communications sector and antitrust cases and subsidies for firms, all the way down to what we presume to be health and safety regulation. Regulation of food and regulation of energy, all of those things can do good things, but they can also go too far and do some bad things.
Getting back to my question, what mechanisms are in place? What mechanisms have the government put in place to track whether the benefits intended by regulations are actually delivered in practice and what they cost?
Bill, this is the big problem we've got, because you can look at the federal budget and see what we spend and know the cost there and know when we have a deficit. There's nothing like that with respect to regulation. What we do have are executive orders that mandate a certain level of cost-benefit analysis.
They do.
Right, but I need to tell you something important about it, though. This started back with Ronald Reagan. He had an executive order, 12291. Everybody knew about it who worked in the regulatory state, who worked in all these alphabet soup bureaucracies. And what it required was that any regulation that was expected to cost over $100 million, so-called economically significant, would get a cost-benefit analysis. Well, that went on for a few years, and then under the Clinton administration, that executive order changed, and the emphasis on review got decreased, because what Reagan did is he established an office within the Office of Management and Budget to review all of these regulations.
And OMB is a scorekeeper.
Exactly. OMB is our Office of Managed Budget that, releases the annual fiscal budget every year, but there's an office within that looks at regulations. You might think of it as a regulatory budget, kind of a budget for the hidden tax of regulation is the way I like to think of it. OMB would review these rules, and they got a lot of flack for it. Under Clinton, that OMB review structure got diminished. And what you see now is there's much less review of regulations. Obama did put out 4 executive orders that were supposed to emphasize more review of regulation. It was also supposed to do things like require retrospective review. In other words, if a rule had been around for a long time, they would look at it and
how's
see,
it doing?
Did this work? Can we go back? What can we do about it? But it didn't really get rid of anything, Bill. You might remember a couple of years ago at the State of the Union address, President Obama was talking about regulations being out of control, if you can believe it. He did talk about it in the State of the Union address, and he talked about getting rid of a regulation that treated spilled milk as an oil, and he got a big laugh out of the audience.
I remember that.
Yeah, but the problem is he only cut about $5 billion in regulations and over his entire term.
Now, $5 billion sounds like a lot of money. What is that in percentage?
$5 billion is nothing. We don't have time to go into it today, but I tabulate the total cost of regulation is close to $2 trillion, about $1.8 trillion. But what Obama has done is just in the last year, just looking at his recent statement on cost and benefits of regulations, he's added $20 billion in new regulatory costs just last year in his draft report on cost benefit analysis, and he still hasn't put out the final report, and we now need the draft 2014 report, and we don't have it. Bottom line, Bill, is every year there are over 3,500 rules that come out of the federal government. I put together a little chart that I like to call the funnel, looking at those 3,500 rules, and when everything drops out at the bottom, you know how many rules last year had a cost-benefit analysis? 14.
Really? That's
14 out of 3,500. So it's fewer than. So your question was, what are the mechanisms in place to deal with regulation and make sure we do it right? Well, the problem is we've got all of these rules pouring out of these agencies like chocolate bunnies, and we get 14 of them that have a cost-benefit analysis.
So it sounds like it's pretty much been shut down. You publish a report every year called 10,000 Commandments that tracks both the number and cost of federal regulations. It's hard to visualize a trillion-dollar stack of bills, but throw some numbers at us. How have the costs of regulations grown over the past 10 years?
Well, look, you and I have had conversations before and talked about how boring facts and figures are. So I'm not going to bore you, though. I'm going to tell you some things that might sound a little bit negative, but as we get into, kind of what do you do about all this, I'm actually very optimistic about things. But first, let me say, I've been doing this report now for 20 years, which means you're getting old. And I'm just about to put out the 21st edition of 10,000 Commandments. And the purpose of it is this. We know the federal government spends close to $4 trillion, just this February, Obama. That's right, on the fiscal budget. Obama released his budget request of $3.9 trillion. And I'd mentioned before that I peg regulatory costs now at about $1.86 trillion annually. So more than half the level of the fiscal budget itself is the cost of regulation.
Well, stick with that. Who pays that bill?
Yeah, these are compliance costs and economic costs. So the compliance costs are borne, by the businesses who have to deal with it, by large companies and small. I mean, you can take charts. In fact, I'm trying to work with some Hill offices here on fleshing this out. But you can look at the way regulations stack up as a small firm grows. First you got to get everything together before you even hire an employee. But then when you got 1 employee, 5 employees, 10 employees, and on up, and now because of Obamacare, all businesses stop at 49 employees. but you get the point.
It's a tough line to cross.
Right, but when you talk about certain sectors, the chemical industry, energy industry, all of these new regulations apply. But let me just say, I'd mentioned the 3,500 regulations that come out every year, and we were talking about how those are not tracked. I do a little thing in 10,000 Commandments. I call it the Unconstitutionality Index, because I agree with you, facts and figures can be boring, so you got to come out with ways to make it interesting. Last year, the regulatory agencies, there's 60 of them that I track, put out 3,600 rules, but meanwhile, Congress passed and the president signed only 72 laws. So there are 51 regulations for every law coming out.
So the combinatorial explosion that takes place once the bills get passed over to the administration.
Well, that's one of the things. I know you've talked about this a lot. When the Obamacare legislation passed, and then we had to pass it to see what's in it, and now we're finding out. Same thing with something like DoddFrank. In a way, we're in a little bit of a pickle because Congress benefits when it delegates that power to regulatory.
Well, they're not accountable anymore.
They're not accountable anymore. And then also kind of the way government works, once they've delegated that and kind of gotten that out of their hair, they can turn to someone else and say, well, what do you need regulated? What do you need done? And what law do you need passed? And it frees up Congress's time to do more mischief.
They could basically market their services to more lobbyists because they're not busy cleaning up the messes they've made.
Indeed, that's exactly what happens. Regulation is important. I joke sometimes, government's got an important job to do. It needs to pick a state bird and kind of leave it at that, tongue in cheek. But seriously, there are important things to do. And the problem we have with this regulatory state, I'd mentioned the numbers of rules and what had come out under Obama. His Federal Register last year, which is kind of the daily depository of all these rules and regulations, the Federal Register hit over 79,000 pages last year. In his 2 prior years, he had topped 80,000 pages a year in his Federal Register. In all of the U.S. history, of the 5 highest ever Federal Register page counts, 4 of them have occurred under Obama. Now, I'm not saying, the regulatory state is his fault, because if you go back, Republicans are very heavy regulators.
It's a bipartisan problem.
Absolutely. This is a bipartisan problem. Under Bush, obviously we got the huge Homeland Security set of regulations and TSA regulations. We've got the Medicare prescription drug. There was a reluctance there under that administration to ever do anything that needed to be done with respect to telecom liberalization and things like that. The Republicans brought us the antitrust laws. They brought us the EPA. They brought us the Energy Department, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Now, you were talking about benefits and regulation. What these agencies are trying to do, I grant that what they're trying to achieve are good things.
The intentions are always good.
Yeah, the problem you run into, though, is just because you create an agency or decide on a value and name an agency after it, the things that you then start to do are not necessarily regulation. They can be cronyism, like you say, but they can also undermine real regulation. We and a lot of us in the free market movement talk about this problem that we have. The things that you want to do with regulation are, things that everybody desires, but if the agencies step in and regulate it, what they do or what they achieve may not end up helping people. I mean, I don't know of any tainted meat that's not approved by the USDA, kind of a jokey way to put it. But when the federal regulators put a floor in or put a standard in, sometimes the competitive advantage to exceeding that federal floor, that regulatory floor, goes away. And this can cut across the board. It can be with respect to food safety. It can be internet privacy. It can be cybersecurity. It can be safety in new technologies like nanotech and biotech. All of these kinds of areas matter a lot, and I think it's really, really important not to lose sight of the fact. It's fine to criticize markets, but it's important to recognize that markets do have a role in continuing to raise the bar in making health and safety and economic efficiency and all competitive features.
Look at Whole Foods in the grocery business. Look at what they're doing. No regulators driving them, and they seem to be doing great.
Right, and there's a huge market for what they try to do, and it's a wonderful thing. But what regulators tend to do is come in and say no. What markets do is say, well, there are a range of preferences. There are different preferences on privacy. There's some people want to be hermits, and some people want to be on amihotornot.com. You've got the whole spectrum. Markets can give you what you want, can put you where you want on that spectrum, but regulators can tend to get you somewhere where you don't necessarily want to be. Even something as important as food safety and unintended effects. I've been studying economics at William & Mary and George Mason, and then when I started working at FDA for a short time as I was getting into public policy, and I was working on the food labeling amendments back then. I worked on the regulatory impact analysis at that time. What the government was trying to do, and what it did do, was deny companies the right to make health claims. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you can say, okay, well, yeah, these companies are out of control. They're going to lie. They're going to say the food is doing it. Okay, fine. You can believe that, and in some cases it may occur. But what do you do to the incentive structure, and what do you do to consumer information when you deny the right to make a health claim? What happens is, since companies can no longer emphasize the health characteristics of their food, they're going to advertise other things like convenience and portability and microwavability and whether it's in a tube that you can squeeze or not. So you can end up with a competitive structure where the health characteristics of new foods introduced actually goes down rather than up.
They're not part of the competitive complex anymore.
Exactly. So it's an important thing to recognize, but it seems, Bill, like we never learn.
It's the
There's
unseen.
a whole new slate of federal regulations from FDA requiring new labeling standards.
But it's Bastiat's seen and unseen, and all of the things that they nip off, the ability in the banking industry now to innovate, nipping off, you don't see that. Let's get to a specific law that's been much in the news. The DoddFrank law regulating the financial industry was supposed to solve the too big to fail problem, supposed to make sure we never see another Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac mortgage meltdown, and it was supposed to eliminate the kind of fragility that froze financial markets, leading to panicked bailouts. Did it solve those problems?
I don't think it did. I am not a financial expert, but let me say this, Bill. We're in a country, and this is true of the globe, the federal government regulates interest rates and money supply and banking in this country and has for a long, long time. Capitalism is very new. Even agriculture is only 10,000 years old. Capitalism is very new, and I'll grant that we don't always do things right and that markets can make mistakes and we can do things wrong. CEI, my group, was long ago on record with respect to government-sponsored entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, with the incentives that they created. You try to do a good thing by expanding home ownership and getting more people into houses that in some cases they couldn't afford. That became obviously true, and it was said over a decade ago. Warnings were put out about that. I'm not going to say here that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac created meltdown and things like that. I'll leave that to others to decide. But what I will say is that the warnings were sounded. It was ignored. And then when things did go wrong, what happened? More government was proposed as the answer. Now, financial stability is vital. It's the core to our competitive market economy. It's the core to the global economy. But stability matters, and where you are on that continuum of safety and reserves in banks and whether or not banks speculate with their deposits and things like that, all of those things are things that are not obvious. The answers to how they should be controlled aren't obvious. What DoddFrank has done, and prior to that,
the Sarbanes-Oxley, yeah, we've had plenty.
So we do have plenty. We keep adding regulations, but every article I see, if professionals are asked, well, have we solved the too big to fail problem? The answer seems to be always no.
We seem to have institutionalized it. Now we've institutionalized certain banks, and we've designated them as significant entities, and now they have a backstop.
I absolutely agree. And you know why that's bad, Bill, also is because one regulatory sector will take cues from another. And what first alarmed me when I first even heard the phrase too big to fail or structural instability and things like that, my impression right then was, well, look, markets do create risks. New products have risks, new services have risks, new financial instruments have risks, but markets, if they're not impeded, also have disciplinary measures that are supposed to cope with those risks or at least help deal with them so that they don't propagate and spread everywhere. And when I saw this occurring with respect to too big to fail, it reminded me of things like, we keep doing flood insurance, and millionaires keep on building their homes on
low-lying areas. And
I thought this is just, that was a small example of government doing something stupid. Now we might be doing the very same thing on a much, much bigger level. So I saw it there, and then it also perturbed me with respect to other things that are very, very important topics right now, like cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. If this philosophy that only government can manage big capitalism, so to speak, or big free enterprise, if that idea really takes root, then that means all of our competitive industries in the future are going to be deemed, critical or too big to fail or critically significant, whatever. They can come up with any terms. But I'm already seeing it happen. I'm writing testimonies and articles on this very, very thing happening with respect to critical infrastructure.
Look at what a great job they did building a website to fix the healthcare industry. Don't you want them building our electrical grid?
They're brand new reports, Bill, on the fragility of the electrical grid. And I think, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll just say real fast that that's a good example because if you look, and I mentioned this about capitalism being so new and we're bound to make mistakes, in the early days of telecommunications, back then you were even transmitting telephone calls across barbed wire out to farms. And the electrical grid, you had competitive companies, not just one utility, not one monopoly. You had competitive companies running lines up and down the streets, all over. It was a huge mess, but you didn't have a natural monopoly problem. You might have had an aesthetic problem or a property rights definition or, right-of-way access or something like that. But these industries were very, very competitive. And certain businessmen get involved. They get the attention of regulators. They get the regulators to
they bend the rules their way. The absolutely.
And they ban competition.
Yeah.
They ban competition.
They're good at it.
And that's what we've done with respect to energy and telecommunications. And we're feeling the fallout of that now. A big part of what we're trying to do is to unwind a lot of these industries from regulation. We're having a little bit of success in telecommunications, trying to get the spectrum out. But then on the flip side, they're imposing new regulations. The Federal Communications Commission is trying to expand its turf with net neutrality and things like that. And, we try to liberalize energy, but instead we get federal government halting projects that work and then trying to impose ones that don't, like these solar subsidies and things like that for Solyndra and things like that. And then, obviously, with financial services and DoddFrank and the Affordable Care Act, those are huge steps back. And the problem is those are huge components of our economy, too.
Bigger and bigger pieces.
I'd mentioned the boring numbers of 3,500 regulations a year, but unfortunately, remember over the past 2 years, Obama has stressed his pen and his phone, and that he's not that he's not going to let Congress stop what he wants to do. Well, what are the implications of that? We may hate federal spending, but we can measure it. Anybody walking past Times Square can go look at
the numbers.
Pull up, you can see it. Regulation, not so much. There are people like me, folks at Heritage, folks at Cato Institute, who like to track the cost of regulations as best we can, knowing that fundamentally they're not measurable. Costs, felt by a third party are really not measurable by you, but we do the best we can. But now, when an executive who doesn't seem to have a lot of concern about separation of powers and what it means to be a limited government, what it means to be a constitutional republic, says he's going to do things with a pen and phone and go around Congress, well,
there's even less oversight.
Those 3,500 rules, I was looking at, so what exactly is he doing when he extends Obamacare waivers or when he changes the rules on what's actually a law that he's supposed to implement? And I asked some colleagues, I said, he's now delayed this thing 20 times, but operationally, what precisely is happening when he does that? I said, is it an executive order? Is it an agency?
It's something new. It's living law. We now have living law.
And nobody knows.
Nobody knows what it is.
You can go and dig it up, but the problem, Bill, is law. I mean law with a capital letter is being made
on the fly
without Congress, and now without even the typical regulatory state.
Let me dig into that with a specific example. We see executive branch agencies, for example, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, acting as combined legislator, prosecutor, judge, and jury. They selectively level billion-dollar fines on companies that pretty much have to settle. They have no choice. How does this square with the separation of powers and due process protections we're supposed to be operating under?
I don't think it does, and I think a bigger problem is, I'm not a lawyer, but I remember taking business law classes back when I was doing graduate work, doing an MBA at William & Mary, and then studying after that. It always gets brought up when you're studying the Administrative Procedure Act about the administrative judges and them being able to, make the law and then enforce the law and then decide the penalties. In my view, a lot of these things are rooted in philosophy. We did go through a progressive era where, there was a notion that the rule of experts mattered and people, you get the best and brightest to make these kind of decisions. I think it's gotten a lot worse recently. We no longer have only a separation of powers problem. We have a government has too much power as such problem. I mean,
what kind of companies thrive in that sort of regulatory environment, and what's the impact on innovation?
You know the answer to that, right? If you've got access to policymakers and you want your company benefited, somebody who's got pull, somebody who's got connections is going to be the one who benefits from that. And we're not just talking abstractly. Last year, you probably saw President Obama was down in Raleigh announcing his new so-called manufacturing hubs, where the federal government is going to pour money into new projects that are favored by the government. Bill, there's so many problems with that. I can barely even contain myself. But you see how it's interpreted, though. Cronyism like that gets accepted, and it's easy to propagate. He then went to Chicago and did the very same thing. But what happens when a president does a high-profile campaign like that, and then NPR does a 10-minute segment on how wonderful it all is, and interviews the beneficiaries, rather than the taxpayers who are having to foot the bill? Things like that propagate because in those same areas, there are representatives who go, I need one of these.
I could do some of that.
State.
Yeah. Well, it's do
some of that. So instead of a couple of major nanotechnology labs, which is how you might imagine, you never know ahead of time, but how you might.
Doesn't every county need a nanotechnology lab?
Yeah, it's suddenly whoa, we need them in every county, and
every post office needs
the
one.
The market's doing 3D printing, but maybe the federal government should do that. Then you create all these problems of the cronyism access, and you create all kind of artificial problems with respect to the the intellectual property status of the discovery. You know, if the taxpayers have funded these manufacturing hubs or funded, you know, biotech breakthroughs or nanotech breakthroughs, you know, doesn't that belong to the taxpayers?
Yeah.
You know, shouldn't the companies be prohibited from making a profit? You know,
Yeah, how does that all work?
we're a long ways from laissez-faire.
Wayne, in the time that we have left, let's get on to some of the sillier stuff that's going on. I understand that they're considering mandating child booster seats, not just for infants, but for children up to 12 years of age. Wouldn't it be easier to just mandate that airbags be permanently mounted to every kid until they leave for college?
Absolutely. You know, I had a professor that, you know, we were talking about unintended effects of regulation. He said, you know, if you really want people to drive safely in cars, you know, don't mandate new airbags and new rollover standards. Just mandate that there be a 6-inch dagger sticking out of the steering column. And then you'll see people drive safely. So the regulations could have the absolute opposite effect. Look, kids in booster seats, you know, the things drive me crazy. I've had to use those for all of my kids.
They're great for infants, but 12-year-olds?
Look, the reason that's happening is because this is a world where the kids are now going to stay on their parents' insurance until they're 27. It used to be that you had, if you were, you know, a hardcore liberal, you had to get mugged to become a conservative. Now you just have to turn 27.
Well, Wayne, it's been delightful. I wish we had more time. Looking forward to the publication of the report, and I appreciate you being on.
I really appreciate you having me. Thank you.
You've been listening to Wayne Cruz, Vice President for Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and author of 10,000 Commandments, published this week. I'm your host, Bill Frezza, here on Real Clear Radio Hour. Ahead, Michael Mandel from the Progressive Policy Institute with a somewhat different perspective. Stay tuned.